Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we're speaking with Mr. Jason Ditz about the recent attacks in Brussels. Mr. Ditz is the news editor at antiwar.com. His works have been featured in numerous publications, including Forbes, Huffington Post, the Toronto Star, the Washington Times, and the Detroit Free Press. You can follow his work at news.antiwar.com, and you can find him on Twitter at Jason Ditz. For more information, see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Brussels. Jason, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So let's just have a very brief background to begin with, and then we'll go into a little bit of what happened before and what is happening after. Can you just give us a brief overview of what happened on the 22nd in Brussels?
Well, we don't know exactly how many people were involved in the plot. There appear to have been 4 would-be bombers, 3 at the Brussels International Airport and 1 in a subway car in central Brussels near the headquarters of the European Union. 2 of the 3 airport bombers detonated themselves near the American Airlines desk in the airport terminal. The 3rd bomber left his bomb behind, which was said to be the largest bomb, and left. He still hasn't been caught, and officials aren't entirely sure who he is. They arrested somebody that they thought might have been him, but it turns out wasn't him. And then the final bomber was on the subway car. He also had a Kalashnikov assault rifle and opened fire on some of the other passengers on the subway train before detonating himself.
Okay, so can you talk about the individuals involved to the extent that we know about them, and the background of the cell responsible for the bombing?
Well, sure. It's interesting. We do have identities for the 3 bombers who actually killed themselves during the attacks, but not for the one that managed to escape. The 2 attackers at the airport that detonated themselves were brothers. They were all involved in this same ISIS cell, which was believed to have been behind last fall's attack in Paris. And this cell dates back quite a long ways. According to some reports, it actually predates ISIS's establishment of itself as a caliphate. And this group's early members sort of came to Syria to join ISIS before the group really had any serious territory, long before there was any U.S.-led coalition against ISIS. And back when ISIS was being portrayed in the media, not necessarily directly as the good guys, but part of an overall coalition of the good guys fighting against the Assad government. Once ISIS started to grow and the anti-ISIS coalition began, this cell, which was overwhelmingly European recruits, was sent back to Europe to start establishing a presence inside Europe and to prepare for retaliatory strikes against the countries that have been bombing them.
And I know that in the media we've seen, especially this quote from Trump where he claims that there had been a growing population of Muslims in Brussels and in Belgium in general. What do you think about statements like that and how it pertains to the growing immigration debate here in the United States?
Well, it's true, but it's misleading. I mean, there are significant Muslim populations in a lot of countries in Western Europe, and they date back to European colonialism in Africa. And near the end of that colonial era, a lot of people, particularly at the end of World War II, started immigrating to the European countries to take relatively good-paying jobs for Reconstruction. Now, when the Reconstruction ended, a lot of them that chose to stay ended up in sort of ghetto areas. They aren't well thought of in a lot of these countries, and some of them are in very poor areas. But the extent to which the Muslim population is growing now, it has in these countries like like France and Belgium, has a lot less to do with immigration than with the simple fact that poorer communities tend to have higher birth rates.
Okay, so let's go back to November with the Paris attacks. In addition to the destruction in Paris and changes in Western foreign policy, we also saw a crackdown in Brussels. So in what way was that connected to what happened here, and what had the situation in Brussels been like for the months leading up to these attacks?
Well, there was a sense that Brussels was, in all likelihood, next. I mean, there were a few cities. London was also talked about as a possible next target after Paris, but Brussels was really the big focus because it has a major presence of this same cell that was responsible for the Paris attack. And the Belgian government, in trying to forestall a potential attack, started launching some very dubious police raids against the Muslim community in and around Brussels, mostly based on the fact that they didn't have great intelligence on who these people are, which ones are liable to be attackers, and very little idea who had actually been to Syria and who hadn't. So in doing so, they drummed up a lot more unrest, although it seems like this particular attack wasn't necessarily a result of the crackdowns, but rather the crackdowns simply had no impact on their ability to continue launching an attack, even though they knew for months that one was probably coming and had even better intelligence in the days and weeks leading up to the Brussels attack that the airport was almost certainly a target.
What about now after the attacks? What is the state of the city? Has the crackdown gone even more extreme? How is the ability to travel in and out of the city like?
It's still not great. It is not easy to travel in and out of Brussels anymore. In the immediate wake of the attack, they shut down virtually everything. Some of that has reopened. I believe the trains are running again. The airport is still virtually inoperable, and there really is no timetable for getting the airport back up and running. As with Paris, the default response from officials seems to be more crackdowns, more restrictions, and more raids. We've seen a lot of people arrested that are presented initially in the media as obviously somebody that was a major player in the attacks, only to have them released a few days later because there simply wasn't any evidence of them being anybody. And despite the fact that these crackdowns, as I say, just simply didn't work to prevent the Brussels attacks, it seems like they're just going back to that and doing more of that, hoping that it prevents a future attack. So
in addition to additional crackdowns, what changes do you anticipate coming, and what changes have already occurred as part of the fallout from the Brussels attacks in the foreign policy of the U.S. and of European countries?
I don't expect a big change from the United States on this one. It's a fairly small attack. They're already escalating the ISIS war at about as rapid a rate as they can without creating any sort of serious public debate on foreign policy. I think, by and large, they're going to let Europe lead on how much they want to escalate after this attack, and I would expect there'll be some more, particularly Western European countries, committing a few more planes here and there, maybe committing a few hundred ground troops for training operations. I don't think it's likely to produce anything as big as the major escalations that we saw after the Paris attack, because it's simply a smaller attack. Belgium is a smaller country. It's not heavily involved in the war and doesn't have a huge military that's capable of going abroad and being a huge participant in these wars.
So why do you think the attacks in Brussels and Paris have been covered just so much in detail in the United States when other attacks by ISIS and the Taliban in other countries like in Beirut or Istanbul have not been covered nearly with as much detail?
Well, some extent, I think it doesn't feel real for the viewing public unless it's in a sort of familiar environment. Western Europe is a very familiar scene for a lot of Americans, not just white Americans, but Americans in general. Scenes of Western Europe, scenes of Paris are all over pop culture. These are major cities that people know about from the time they're little kids and have a picture in their head, whether realistic or not, of what those cities are like. And to hear major attacks like this happening in those cities gives a sense that it could happen in the United States just as easily, where in cities like Istanbul, even if it's a city like Istanbul, which has not historically seen a lot of major terrorist attacks, there's a sense that it's part of the Middle East and attacks in the Middle East are common. So even if it's a city that's not necessarily usually a target, it doesn't seem like as big a surprise to most people, I think.
So do you anticipate future attacks in the Western world? I guess Obama said the other day that ISIS doesn't pose an existential threat to the U.S., and there's been some reporting about counterintelligence suggesting that there will be more attacks in Western Europe. What do you see coming as far as future attacks in the U.S. and Western Europe?
I don't see where there wouldn't be future attacks because the policy that's causing the attacks, the airstrikes against ISIS, isn't going away. To the extent that ISIS set up these cells in Western Europe and to some extent North America to retaliate against airstrikes, they're likely going to continue to do so. I don't expect there to be necessarily a growing number of such attacks compared to what we see a major attack every, 6 months to a year. But I think they will continue in that same vein going forward.
What do you think the proper response should be from the Western powers to stop these terrorist attacks that we've been seeing and stop the violence?
It's a difficult question because there are so many years of bad foreign policy decisions underpinning even the creation of a group like ISIS, its establishment as a major power in the region, and its desire to attack Western targets, that it's going to take a very long time of sort of remedial efforts to get the U.S. and other Western nations out of the Middle East, to get them out of this interventionist philosophy before we really start to see major shifts in the ability of groups like ISIS to recruit and to attract people willing to be suicide bombers to attack Western countries. In the meantime, I think it really is a question of making the war on terror domestically more of a law enforcement issue and less of a military issue, because this sort of militaristic approach with these huge crackdowns just isn't working, and it's only adding to the sense that the minorities that are being recruited by ISIS are an unwelcome minority and are perhaps enemies of the state, whether they do anything or not.
Now, one option that has been mentioned after the attacks in Paris and after some of the attacks in Turkey has been invoking Article 5 of the NATO treaty. So can you talk about what that would mean and what some of the issues with that idea are, and what role you anticipate NATO playing in all of this?
Well, invoking Article 5 and making this, it would make this even more of a military issue. It would basically say that these attacks, these terrorist attacks, are military attacks on NATO members and would oblige all the NATO members to militarily join with the country being attacked to fight against the attacking force. In practice, it probably wouldn't have an enormous impact on the war itself, because most NATO members already are involved to some extent in the anti-ISIS coalition. The ones that aren't involved yet aren't major military powers to begin with and aren't necessarily going to contribute much, even if they are obliged by treaty to do so. But beyond that, I think it would just further the sense that this is sort of a NATO crusade against the Middle East, that this is Western Europe once again trying to impose its will on nations that are vast majority Muslim and would only add to the unrest in those countries.
So yeah, let's talk about the unrest in those countries a little bit. You've briefly mentioned how this is a result of the foreign policy of the U.S. and other Western countries, and how blowback is occurring here. This is a result of blowback. Can you flesh that out in a little more detail? How these policies and how blowback is leading to what we've been seeing and what we saw in Brussels?
Well, sure. I mean, we can trace back ISIS really to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan if we want to go all the way back to the creation of Al-Qaeda, because ISIS originally was an Al-Qaeda affiliate based in Iraq. The U.S. heavily armed the Mujahideen for the Afghan war against Soviet occupation. A lot of these Islamist groups that were allies quickly became U.S. enemies. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 is where we really start to see Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is later ISIS, even existing. To the extent that they existed at all before 2003, they were a handful of people with no real operational capabilities. After the U.S. occupation of Iraq, they became a huge Al-Qaeda affiliate and eventually became so huge that they became a movement in and of themselves, and one that's arguably at this point far larger than Al-Qaeda ever was. But it's been a steady stream of bad foreign policy decisions going back decades that has fostered this environment where these groups can recruit like this, that you don't see historically in the Muslim world in eras where there isn't major Western intervention or intervention from some other foreign power. You simply don't see these radical Islamist groups getting any sort of major push where they're getting enough recruits to be anything more than a nuisance for the countries that they're based in.
It's unfortunate that that's the case. I think it is very telling what you were saying before. It could take many years of corrective policy before something like this could ever be eradicated. But fighting hard against it and continuing to be aggressive will only make the problem worse.
Right. And it is unfortunate that at this point it's been so many years of building up this problem that if we suddenly had an ideal foreign policy where the United States just completely withdrew from the region, they're not making matters any worse, but that ISIS group is still has enough momentum that it's going to exist for years to come. It's a problem that's not going away, no matter what the policy is.
Let's go back to the events in Brussels of the last couple weeks. One of the things that happened right before the attacks was the capture of Salah Abdeslam, one of the individuals who was involved in the Paris attacks. So how did his capture come about, and what role did that play in the timing and the occurrence of the Brussels attacks?
It sounds like it may have had quite an impact on the timing of the Brussels attack. Ever since the Paris attacks, they've been looking for Abdeslam, not particularly effectively, because we have a litany of instances where he gets pulled over, police don't realize who he is and they let him go, or they raid a place that he was only to find out he's not there anymore. Finally, if just the odds finally coming up in their favor, they managed to launch a raid where they did capture him. And while it's to some extent speculation and we can't prove it one way or another, there's certainly a sense that any attacks that the people in the cell in Brussels were planning probably did get moved up by his capture over fear that now that he's in custody, he might spill the beans and lead to more arrests or foil future attacks for them. So the Brussels attacks were certainly going to happen at some point, but they might not have happened exactly when they did without Abdeslam's capture.
And I know you talked about this before, but what was the extent of the casualties and the destruction of property that we saw in the attack?
It's enormous. I mean, we have Death tolls, I've seen as high as 35. Most recently, they talked about 32. I'm not sure why it went down. Injuries are in the hundreds, certainly. Damage, I think the property damage already done at the airport and at the area around the subway station is certainly significant, but I think the true economic cost probably won't be known for years as this is tourists away from Brussels, as the airport, once it does fully reopen, may find itself a less popular venue. I mean, a lot of this simply, we don't know yet how much it's going to hurt the Belgian economy, but it's going to be significant.
Well, our thoughts are definitely with the family members and people who were affected by these attacks. It's always very difficult to watch this sort of stuff happen.
That's definitely for sure. As with most such instances, the victims, by and large, had nothing to do with the war on terror. They were just innocent bystanders, and this is really what happened in both the countries that are being attacked by the Western powers and by the countries that are getting the blowback, is that, by and large, the victims aren't the ones that have anything to do with the policy itself.
Right, and it's just so unfortunate and sad to see in Brussels, in Paris, in Turkey, Pakistan, Lebanon, everywhere where this has happened. So before we wrap up, I just want to ask you, now we've touched on this a little bit over the course of the interview, but how would you describe ISIS's strength right now, and where do you see that group headed in the near future, and what do you think could bring about their downfall and their demise?
Well, right now we see a lot of reports, particularly citing Western military leaders and Iraqi security officials, claiming that ISIS is dramatically weaker in the last 6 to 8 months, that they've sustained heavy losses in the fighting, and that they're, by all indications, on their last legs. I don't think that's a realistic belief, though, because all of these predictions are not new, that ISIS is just about to disappear, and they continue to launch attacks at roughly the same rate they always have. We saw similar things in Afghanistan with the Taliban, where the Pentagon has been claiming that they're just about to turn the corner in that war for, what's it been, almost 15 years now. And I think the ISIS war is going to go much the same way, where there are sort of always predictions of better days just around the corner that never seem to arrive. And as far as what would cause ISIS's ultimate downfall, I think it's going to have to be a point at which they simply aren't able to recruit at levels that will allow them to sustain any sort of offensive operation. And that doesn't necessarily mean killing enough ISIS people that they can't replace the people that are being killed, because historically that hasn't worked with terrorist groups. Killing terrorists only seems to increase their ability to recruit more terrorists. But weakening the group's sort of argument for existence, weakening the sense that they're fighting a Western invasion of their countries, would have a major impact on their ability to draw in more recruits. And I do think ISIS probably is going to retain some territories for many years, possibly decades to come, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be a major aggressive power like they have been in the last couple of years, that they may ultimately have to scale back their interest in seizing more territory and in fighting abroad and just be another small state in the Middle East.
Do you think infighting will play a role in their demise? And has there been infighting already? I guess I've read a little bit about infighting between those out of Mosul and those out of Raqqa. But how prevalent is infighting with ISIS?
It's really hard to say because, of course, we don't have great media based in ISIS territory that are getting a lot of on-the-ground reports. There's a lot of secondhand indication that there's some infighting. There's a lot of instances where ISIS riles up local tribal leaders that were sort of nominally accepting of their presence and start a big battle with a tribal militia like that, while they certainly are going to weaken ISIS, probably aren't going to be what leads to their ultimate defeat. I think, by and large, a religiously based group like that is going to have its religious leaders calling the shots. And for the most part, I think the people that have already bought in and joined up are going to want to listen to those religious leaders. So unless you start seeing some major clerics that are involved in their Islamic court system disagreeing with one another and getting into factional battles, I don't see where it's going to be a serious threat to ISIS's existence.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. And where can our listeners go to find some of your work?
Well, for the most part, it's antiwar.com, news.antiwar.com. Virtually the whole top news section on antiwar.com's main page is things that I've written. News.antiwar.com is more or less entirely things I've written. Occasionally you can find things other places, but that's the main place, and it's the place that you're going to find links to most of the other stuff too.
Well, I highly encourage that everyone check out news.antiwar.com, and of course we'll link to it. The place to find that link and every resource and link related to this episode is wakeupcallpodcast.com/Brussels. And as I said, I highly recommend everyone check out news.antiwar.com. So on that note, Jason, thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully we can talk to you again soon as more developments take place around the world.
Good. Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.